So I'm going to go through a little bit about how great he is so that you can get an idea of how awesome this is going to be. So, so Dr. Kofi Boone is a professor of landscape architecture at North Carolina State University in the College of Design. He holds the Joseph D. Moore Distinguished Professor post. That is a pretty big deal over there. He's a Detroit native. He's happy to tell you that. He got his undergrad and his master's degree at the University of Michigan. And I think one of the things that I find so interesting about his work is that he has this way of overlapping landscape architecture with environmental justice. And so we get to learn a little bit more about that today during his presentation. But it is got some specializations within democratic design, digital media, and interpreting cultural landscapes. His teaching and professional work has earned awards, including student and professional ASLA awards, excuse me. He was also the former president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation, which we should all be familiar with. And make sure you apply to those scholarships when they come up, just so y'all know. But he was also served on the advisory board of the Black Landscape Architecture Network. That's an organization that I am very active in and that I find very important. So it's really awesome to have somebody like him of his caliber being a part of that organization and coming and talking to us today. He's a frequent speaker at national conferences and has a lot of speaking engagements because he has a lot of really interesting and important things to say. So I'm very excited that you guys are going to all be here to listen to him. He does have several published works within peer-reviewed journals like the Landscape Architecture Magazine, the Conservation, and the Journal of Landscape and Urban Planning. And then a little bit about what he's going to be talking to us about too is he does have a book coming out, and it's called Empty Pedestals. He'll talk about that more in his lecture, but that is just a very small summation of the things that he does, and so I'm very happy to have him here, and I'm really excited for you guys to listen to what he has to say. So with that being said, Kofi, you're on.
My remarks are tied to this topic because it's something that's consumed a lot of our time recently, and it's something we think about a lot. How landscape architecture enables the experiences, the relationships, the settings to create memories. So from an ecological standpoint, if you've ever read Last Child in the Woods and you learn about nature deficit disorder, you realize that children, when their brains are developing, there's a window when they're young until they get to middle school when they're most amenable and open to learning about the environment. That has numerous physical, spiritual, mental benefits, but it also you can track them, which means that if they've had really valuable experiences with nature at that age, they tend to vote for policies that support environmental protection. They tend to volunteer for environmental organizations. They tend to pass that tradition on to the next generation. So we don't often think about the tools of landscape architecture as things that enable us to create those experiences. And we have more of a comfort level with that with the ecological and non-human side. We don't have as much of a comfort level with the social, cultural side for a lot of reasons. But there are a lot of imperatives, including what's happening right now all around the world, that illustrate that there's a need, there's a void for thinking about how to think about culture and history and the social side with the same complexity and intensity that we do the ecological side, the non-human side of the house. So Future Memories of Place is about this provocation, this idea that whenever you're making something, even in your renderings, you're showing it a generation after it's been built. Right? You're imagining how people are going to be using it. You're hoping it's going to last and endure and be of value and important to that next generation, such that they value it, care for the next generation to use it. So part of our responsibility that I think we can pick up is Future Memories of Place. I have a lot of friends in the Native American, American Indian, Indigenous communities. They hate land acknowledgments, just to be direct with you. But, you know, when we're meeting and when we're working together, like, just talk about Mother Earth and Turtle Island, and we're good. So this is my land acknowledgement. This actually is a sketch that came from a workshop we did with the American Indian Center at UNC, working with 7 different American Indian tribes across North Carolina on a garden concept, which they are developing right now on UNC's campus. So thank you, Mother Earth. Thank you, Turtle Island. We're going to move on. Memories, narrative. So you've heard this term used a lot. Narratives are really important. As I was talking with some of the students today, they were asking, well, how did I get interested in this topic? As mentioned by Sam and by my children, my daughter in particular, nobody talks about Detroit except for people from Detroit, so I'm professionally obligated to talk about Detroit in a nice light. Because if you have not been to Detroit, there may be a narrative about that particular city. It may trigger issues of safety, or maybe a symbol of ruin and decline, or failure, or all these other pieces. What's important that you know is that I didn't think that at all growing up in Detroit. I thought Detroit was a beautiful city. I had a really good time growing up in Detroit. That's how I got introduced to Frederick Olmsted, who designed this. This is Belle Isle Park. It's the largest island park in the United States. It's between the US and Canada. That's one of the benefits of living in Detroit. It's the largest North American city north of Canada. So Canada's to the south. So that's Canada, that's the United States. This was our form of recreation, biking, walking, seeing nature. There's a backstory about them running Olmsted out of town, which in another lecture I'll get into. But we spend a lot of time in the Detroit River, right? So this was our physical contact with nature, even in an urban environment. And it's one of the great places for art. So particularly in the early 20th century, leading up to the Great Depression and immediately after World War II, this is the great Detroit Industry Mural, which is in the Detroit Institute of Arts, painted by Diego Rivera, one of his great works, which illustrates his propaganda, right? So now we're getting into narrative. He was a Marxist, right? So he comes to Detroit. He's working for Henry Ford. He's seeding his images with some Marxist propaganda, right? So you see like multiracial coalitions happening here. Off this chart, this is supposed to be the Model T plant, the Rouge plant, just south of Detroit in Dearborn. He has the gods that represent different elements looking down and sort of casting judgment on the people working together. But it really is the ethic of the city. So when you get right down to it, if someone asks you where the heart of the city is, it's probably the Rivera mural. So those are the places that I remember. With regards to design, though, our exposure to it, while there were great places and great ways to learn about it, was also the negative consequences of design decisions. So even at lunch today, we talked about the legacy of freeways and redlining. Detroit is one of the poster children of that. So this is Hastings Street. This is the heart of what was known as Black Bottom in Detroit in the early 20th century, a place where in the Great Migration, African Americans came from Alabama and Mississippi, settled and created businesses and lives here. But because of the color of their skin, they were redlined, meaning that through the Home Ownership Loan Corporation, they were ineligible for any kind of funding for business development or home ownership, which sent a generational pattern of disinvestment. So we're talking about the 1920s and 1930s. So by the time you get to urban renewal in the post-war era, those are the places that were targeted and the most sensitive to things like that, freeway development and urban renewal. In my hometown of Durham, we're completing a study with the North Carolina Department of Transportation, analyzing these similar impacts in our state. I live in Durham. Durham is home of the Haytide community, the home of North Carolina Central University, as well as some of the original black wealth in the state of North Carolina. Went through the same thing, the permanent dislocation of 4,000 local businesses, 10,000 residents, and no recompense, no elements there. Right? But Detroit is also a home of organizing and resistance and models of multiracial coalitions that are required in order to engage in that work. So this is one of Detroit's great couples historically. So Grace Lee Boggs, the woman smiling in the foreground. You cannot change any society unless you take responsibility for it, unless you see yourself as belonging to it and responsible for changing it. In my experience of work with communities and environmental justice issues, they don't feel they belong. So they don't know how to participate. And it forces division because there's trauma. So part of this is about history, memory, narrative, and acknowledging these traumas as a part of our work, and that we have a responsibility to heal. A term that was important to me when I was in your shoes as students was this one, history from below. Right? So it's a shorthand way of describing social history. So if you've read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, instead of from the master narrative frame, the official stories, presidents and great people, is highlighting people who are in the midst of different parts of movements. So it's like looking at key historical events from a totally different perspective. And I hope that you all in the future acknowledge your teachers and instructors as well. This crew was really important to me when I was at Michigan, both undergrad and grad. The great Dorceta Taylor, of course, is at Yale, who pioneered a lot of structural analysis, barriers preventing diversity and inclusion within environmental fields. Jim Chafer is the first PhD in architecture in the country, but who also was influential. Sharon Sutton and Bunyan Bryant, who I have to admit, when I heard his name first met, I started laughing. And he looked just like that big bald spot on his head, the whole thing. But of them all, is probably the one that had the most influence on me. Because at that time, and this guy, I should mention this guy too. So in fact, in the dedications to the book, Kay Grandison was teaching landscape architecture at the time. So he was the one who introduced me to J.B. Jackson and a lot of that legacy in his writings in landscape. To Howard Zinn, and to thinking about traditional forms of landscape from a different lens and a different piece. He's at University of Virginia now. One reason why I dedicated it is because although he was hired in landscape architecture, at the time he was hired, he wasn't considered to be doing landscape architecture. And so he was politely repositioned to English. And so as I think about my position now in landscape architecture, considering what he had to face a generation early in terms of the really diminution of his voice and his attitudes, this book in a way is sort of a full circle salute to that. And this guy who I was just on the phone with last week, Everfly. So there are only two landscape architects who got Presidential Medals of Excellence. Lori Olin is the first one, so if you're familiar with the Olin Partnership, but that's the second one. This is the first black graduate from Harvard's MLA program at the GSD. Everfly, who's based in San Antonio, Texas, his claim to fame was his work in Eatonville, Florida, which is near Orlando, Florida, was facing the threats of growth and displacement and gentrification. They were concerned about holding on to the qualities of that place, and he was the one who decided to go through its most famous residence notes. Zora Neale Hurston, the great writer, poet, anthropologist, who grew up there, and in her writings described her place and the key ingredients to place, and took those writings and turned it into a zoning code to highlight the things that she talked about as part of her movement as a way to protect it. So everything from, we sat on that porch and looked at that tree. He went there and found that porch and found that tree and mapped it. So it really revolutionized in some ways the way we think about cultural landscapes. A most recent call was he has taken on unmarked burial grounds as his mission at this point in life. And we're embarking on a project on that in North Carolina. But a great guy. Also, I'm old enough to say that I wasn't in college when the modern environmental justice movement started, but the ripple effects were felt when we were there. So there are a lot of stories about the origins of environmental justice, what we consider the modern movement, meaning after assassination of Dr. King, because in some cases him going to Memphis to support sanitation workers is seen as one of these early synergies in the 20th century. But it really comes down to two. One is Robert Buller's great work in Southwest Houston, who was the first person, his wife actually asked him to create a map correlating race and the numbers of landfills in Southwest Houston. She's an attorney. She was doing a class action lawsuit against the city of Houston because of an overburden of that particular situation. But the other one is this one. And this is an hour away from my offices in Raleigh. This is Warren County in North Carolina. PCBs were outlawed, were banned. They were required to be disposed of. In our state, what people did is they sprayed them in the middle of the night in drainage ditches in poor communities. Yes, they got caught. They got caught and were required to gather up all the PCBs they distributed, put them in a landfill. All right, who wants a landfill full of PCBs? Nobody. You all are too young to even know what PCBs are, but they'll kill you. Very detailed analysis that talks about site selection of this landfill. And one of the qualities and the characteristics was political organization and awareness, which is to say they picked on communities that didn't know environmental policies, that didn't have good legal representation, that didn't understand the impacts of PCBs. So in this case, Warren County, the poorest county in our state at that time, saw jobs, they saw money for new roads. They saw a lot of the economic benefits and accepted the PCB landfill. But a lot of civil rights activists who hadn't been active since the modern civil rights movement reactivated, right, and started to deploy nonviolent direct action tactics to block the PCB landfill construction. It did end up happening in 1982. However, a bunch of nerdy academics, including old Bunyan Bryant and Bob Bullard and Rosita Taylor, were there taking nerdy notes. And they teamed up with Reverend Ben Chavis, who at that time was the director of the United Church of Christ. And that's where toxic waste and race came from in 1987, which demonstrated that the #1 factor for determining one's risk exposure to hazardous waste in our country is not wealth, it's not urban versus rural, it's race. It's a national study, early GIS that did this particular work. Why is that important? Because that was the evidence base that was used for this gentleman, President Clinton, to sign the first executive order on environmental justice, which frames a lot of the policy now. This is where the EPA's Office of Environmental Justice comes from. This is where the new tools that have come out, including CGEST and others, were originated, was through that groundswell of action and that 5 years of academic work leading up to that. So those were some of the roots. And as I told some of the students, I wasn't terribly thrilled about moving to the South. Coming from the Midwest, we actually have a lot of biases and stereotypes about the American South. And this is sort of a quick illustration of that before we pivot to the next topic. The Great Gordon Parks. This is an image from Mobile, Alabama. A wonderful family on a decent street. They could use more trees. I'm not going to hate completely, but a decent image. And it's all good until you actually see the full picture, right? And so this idea that how do these reconcile, right? Whose place is it? Who belongs in this particular place? And what kind of strength and fortitude is required for people to hold their dignity and carry themselves as citizens in the midst of signals that are sent through the landscape and through the built environment? And that was the impetus for this article, which was included in Walter's book, was at the time the Black Lives Matter movement was in full swing. This is a quote from Alicia Garza, one of the founders of that movement. When you asked her what she wanted out of it, she said to be seen, to live with dignity, to be connected. And the whole point of that particular article, when it came out, and full disclosure, as an academic, came out like 4 years before the BLM strikes and nobody read it. So anybody who's ever written anything, you had to sit there collecting dust on a shelf. But when all of that happened, people started to read it and circulate it and talk about it. Were these 3 basic ideas in terms of what do we need to cultivate a sense of belonging and create places that deal with that. That article went into a critique of landscapes that we know, that are associated with the design traditions of others, but ignore the contributions, particularly of Black people and African American and cultures. This is the first plantation I ever went to, in Middleton Place, right outside Charleston, South Carolina. For designers and for landscape architects, significant because of the butterfly lakes. It's the first garden in the United States that has a camellia. That's where camellias came from. The owners of the plantation got their wealth from rice. Right? It's hard for people to believe that they would build a plantation and not have a crop. And there was a period of time when Charleston didn't have rice, and they were struggling. So some folks from Trinidad and Barbados and those places said, well, hey, you want to know how to grow rice? There's like West African tribes that have been growing rice for hundreds of years. They're basically engineers. They already do it. The Wolof people in Senegal, also the home of jollof rice, one of my favorite foods. So they already know how to do it. They know how to build the dikes, the structures. They know how to staff it. You don't need to do anything. Plus, there was malaria down there. People forget about that as well. So if you ever do a long visit to Charleston, you'll find that there are these patterns when landowners were not on their properties because they didn't want to die, right, from malaria. I've had malaria, so I can feel their pain a little bit. But the point is that they specifically went after Wolof people from Senegal who had the knowledge of growing rice and had the sickle cell trait, because the sickle cell trait makes you resistant to malaria. And there were extended periods when they were building this thing by themselves. So who built it? Who designed it? And why don't we think the working lands that provided the wealth? As a matter of fact, Carolina rice, which is a strain that came from West Africa that was propagated by these people, was the birth of the wealth of South Carolina, which at its height was the wealthiest colony in the United States. So we somehow, in our history and in our memory, edit, right? We focus on the aesthetics, focus on the form. We don't focus on the full context around which this occurred, and we displace people. And it's hard to say that in the midst of these deplorable conditions, we should be celebrating anything that African people did, because they had no rights, they were enslaved. Right? However, it's an example of the importation of that cultural tradition, that pattern, that technology, that expertise, and it's an adaptation to the new place. And it's not the only place where this is true. In the July issue of Landscape Architecture magazine last year, the cover article was Fort Negley that I wrote with Sahar Costin Hardy, the largest inland fort in the United States, right outside of Nashville, Tennessee, built to protect the back of Nashville after the Union Army ran the Confederates out of there, right? But built with free black labor, resulting in 700 deaths. The Union Army treated free black people in the same way that the Confederates taught enslaved black people. Nobody knows that particular story. The only reason why that story came up is that they're living descendants from those people who advocated for decades and said, nobody's telling the story of our people and the contribution to this particular place. And it wasn't celebrated until they found unmarked graves on this site when they were preparing it for redevelopment. Led to a groundswell from the whole city to say, well, we got to stop this thing. And we have to rethink this entire plan. The idea was to turn it into apartments and mixed-use development. Charles Birnbaum from the Cultural Landscape Foundation, a good friend, he got involved with this particular situation. Were successful with it, got a bond issue, and they're in the midst of some reconciliation. So they worked with Vanderbilt University, they worked with various universities to create an archive to kind of catalog these histories. They have a very sensitive master plan that puts a light touch on the ground that doesn't require the excavation of those places. They're doing the things the right way. So HDLA was the prime consultant. Liz Sargent, who I think was here recently, was the preservation consultant there. And we got into a really good conversation because in their approach, Fort Negley, from a cultural perspective, not unlike El Morro and Old San Juan in Puerto Rico, which Liz also worked on. So there was something about this type that allowed people to do it. Well, what does this mean? So when I was in your shoes, if someone asked me to do a site analysis, it'd be pretty basic, right? I give you some soils, I give you some slope. I might have a few pictures. This is before mainstream GIS, Google Earth, or any of that stuff. But it's forced us to think about this in a different kind of way. What context within which we're working, particularly in the Southeast in the United States. When I was in your shoes, we never acknowledged indigenous land or colonialism. And whose land is this? I have a colleague and a friend, Pierre Belanger, who has a whole thing about no design on stolen land. He says if you don't have an agreement with the local indigenous community to proceed with the landscape project, you should not. But that should be the first step you do in every particular project. Now, Pierre is pretty tough, right? If you've ever watched this video on the LAF website, you'll get a sense of how tough he actually is. But it is interesting looking at the disparities and the differences in the land laws over time. When I came to North Carolina, when I was working in landscape architecture, we never talked about slavery, like at all. It only came up with plantations, and it was the aesthetic of plantations. It wasn't the function of them or how they operated or how they worked within the economy. But that's different now. This is one of the oldest census maps we have in the United States. What it is a map showing an 1860 enslaved African population in what are now the Confederate States. The darker the color, the higher the percentage in population. It's also a geology map, because the darkest parts of that map are along the Mississippi Delta, parts of South Carolina, and other places, and start to highlight what's known as the Black Belt, which talks about the soil there. One of my friends and mentors, Randy Hester, talks about the only reason why North Carolina is not that dark on the map is that the soil is bad. North Carolina has this reputation to be this moderate state until recently, right? Not too hardcore, not too liberal, sort of in the middle. He's convinced that's just geology. If the soil was better, we would be just as bad as the rest of the place. And how resilient those patterns are. This is a racial dot map from 2010, which mirrors that map from 1860 almost exactly. So although we talk about diversity and inclusion, and it's got to be better from now, there are some parts of the American South that are more segregated than they were 50 years ago. And that controls opportunity in some cases. The research of Raj Chetty out of Harvard that talks about upward mobility and predicting one's ability to jump from the lowest rungs of poverty out of it. The irony is that the places that are most difficult are Atlanta and Charlotte, which sounds crazy when you see how much it's growing and it's booming and it has so much development happening. Those are the lowest chances that you have in the whole country of getting out of poverty. So there's some persistent patterns and elements that are new to our vocabulary that we're discovering, that we're needing to build partnerships to understand, but are that ecology. And the saying that we think about the complexity of the non-human systems that are affecting how we operate things. My colleague and I, Julian Edgemont, Julian, author of Just Sustainabilities and also head of planning at Tufts University, co-authored an article kind of reclaiming the other side of it, which is we know the downsides, but are there positive things? Is there another system that we're not aware of? During the pandemic, systems of mutual aid were popping up everywhere. Systems of collaboration and cooperation. People felt like they were inventing them, but they come from a very rich legacy. And in some cases are really specific to where we are. Still the most published sociologist of all time, W.B. Du Bois, wrote extensively about cooperatives. Coming out of Reconstruction, a strategy for people who have modest resources to pool their resources together. Buyers cooperatives to bring the prices of goods down. Producer cooperatives to be able to organize and charge a proper price for it. Other forms of cooperatives. He created handbooks, they did metrics. In the early 20th century, there were 4,000 of these things operating across the United States, specifically black cooperatives. Grocery stores, banks, life insurance companies. This geography is a little bit invisible. We don't know where all these are and where they dealt with them. And more specific, closer to home, the great Fannie Lou Hamer, who, as a part of her work, proposed Mississippi Freedom Farms, where she was dealing with the poorest people in rural Mississippi who could not own land. These were still sharecroppers, even moving into the middle of the 20th century. Had this grand vision of a 900-acre cooperative farm. And she's sitting there looking at pigs over there. This is the reason why. Her idea was, well, you just give everybody a pig. When the pig has babies, they give a baby back to the cooperative, and then we can give that pig to the next folks, right? So the barter system dealing with animals. If you've heard this before, this is Heifer International, who has said that they got their idea from Fannie Lou Hamer. Right? So this global movement of dealing with cows and other ways of getting animal protein through this barter and exchange system came from an activist in our own backyard. And how this relates to Georgia is this group. Right? So if you've ever heard of a community land trust, inspired by Fannie Lou Hamer's example. Of course, there were land trusts in Europe and other parts of the country, but it's the Schumacher Center in particular that encodes what we now use today as policies to have land trusts all over the country. Any land trust you're dealing with, the template they used came from those folks. And their goal was the economic component of this modern civil rights movement extended into the 20th century, particularly for farmers in southwest Georgia. That was their focus when they started. So why am I bringing this up? These are all systems that are out there. These are all legacies that have connections that could have implications to how we move moving forward. Summer 2020, tumultuous, to say the least. The largest mass movements in the history of recorded history, all over the world. More people protested in those 2 years than every other protest movement combined that we have documented. Right? There's a whole lot of people asking, what does that mean? You know, where are we now? One thing that we talked about at that time were some parallels that bring it back to things that we think about in landscape architecture. Health crisis, right? Pandemic, Economic crisis. In some cases, people unable to work, people losing their homes and their jobs. For sure, climate crisis, as we deal with global climate change and those effects. This has actually happened before. So in the early 20th century, tuberculosis and influenza were the leading killers of people in the United States. Massive pandemics, right? Economic crisis, the Great Depression. Climate crisis, the Dust Bowl. So, about 100 years ago, we were dealing with very similar issues. Well, what did we do about it? Well, that's where this guy becomes famous, right? So the New Deal and a number of those policies, with the caveat that they were all racist, right? So if you were black, you couldn't participate in any of these. But let's just set that to the side for a second, talk about more broadly how we respond to these cumulative crises and what they produce between Tennessee Valley Authority, between farm assistance programs, between Social Security, a number of other strategies. These are things that are still with us today, that for most of our history, we don't question how they contributed to our stability, which was what made this really interesting at that time. The election of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the proposal of the Green New Deal, modeling off of the old New Deal, but in this case focused on jobs, justice, and decarbonization. Right? Justice really important, right? Not an afterthought, integral, a way to separate it from those. So people who are most affected disproportionately by fossil fuels, by exploitation, first in line to receive resources, capacity building, and support to make the just transition to clean energy. It got us really excited at LAF. Right? That's why we ran the Green New Deal Super Studio, because we thought that our technical expertise matched with ground-up mobilization of communities, bubbling up projects that could be eligible to take advantage of these resources, was that match. And from a justice standpoint, getting to know people, right? Helping them to belong, using our technical expertise to build bridges and to connect. We got 3,000 entries from all over the world. We had, at the summit, about 500 people. If you would like to see any of these proposals, there's a JSTOR of all of them that are really well coded, every single one. We were gearing up for this, right? So the Justice 40 initiative, where President Biden, as an executive order, asked every federal agency to come up with a plan in a year for how they would deploy 40% of their just transition resources to frontline communities, to communities that have been most affected by fossil fuels and extraction. The same communities that were out there marching in Warren County, that were there in Houston. So between the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the American Recovery Act, that's $1 trillion that has not been spent, that needs to be spent in the next 5 years. So what we were working on, really, was trying to find ways to mobilize communities, to bubble up projects, to compete for these resources. In our case, for people who might be familiar with the West Side Community Land Trust in Charlotte, it's on the west end of Charlotte near the airport, right? This was our group when we worked on it in the studio, a well-established, well-respected local community group working on affordable housing. Where they were working, though, was a displaced African-American community. Right? These were black people, but there was a black community that was first displaced by a military base, and then by urbanization and displacement. There's a weird triangle, which actually was the real property boundary of that community before it started. So we helped them envision, well, what happens if light rail comes? What happens if you grow this land trust and you expand it not just from housing to cooperatives for shopping? What happens if you start to transform a lot of the streets and mobility systems so you don't need cars? This is one of 3,000 different proposals that came out of that, with metrics to help people understand what those impacts might be from a carbon standpoint. From a professional standpoint, we convened a session at the ASLA meeting in Minneapolis, this past fall. Alexa Bush, who's now at Kresge Foundation, but a great colleague, used to be at the City of Detroit. Tim Dugan at Phronesis, which is in Kansas City. Deb Gunther and Methuen, to talk about how to use these narratives, use these stories, use these imperatives to help communities in what we would call pre-design. Right? Before you have a site, before you have a program, before you know, get into these conversations to help them understand what's possible. In Alexa's case, this was an ASLA award winner and is celebrated in the Climate Action Plan, the Fitzgerald Neighborhood Plan in Detroit, which took different vacant lots, fragmented through a community, and arranged them and resorted them into new mobility systems and stormwater management systems to strengthen those particular communities and add value to attract reinvestment. In Deb's case, North Richmond, in which case they're in the midst of developing a living levee in California, right off the bay, with involvement of local indigenous people, with local frontline communities, in really creative ways. So these are professional projects that continue along that thread. So narrative, right? Narrative is really powerful. How you tell the story, who's included, who's excluded, can make a big difference. Now to shift gears for a second. This lecture is about memory. It's not about history. And they're not the same. How we remember things may have nothing to do with what actually happened. Right? So there are what are called master narratives. I didn't make this word up. This is the normative frame, right? Top down, this is the official story, right? So let's deal with a master narrative. All right, you got southern slave-holding states. You got northern states that don't want slavery, want to abolish slavery. Northern states see southern states as being too powerful, they want to weaken them. They're annexing new properties, so this is overlaid with colonialism. That's why we talked about colonialism before. They're annexing state after state after state. There's going to be this imbalance because the Union's getting the next state. The South goes, no, not going to let you do it. Like shooting shots at Fort Sumter, we're going to war. Master narrative. Devastation. Interesting enough, the birth of Memorial Day. Memorial Day comes from formerly enslaved African Americans actually tending to the bodies and tending to the unburied soldiers from the Union Army, particularly in Charleston. That's where that national holiday came from. The compromise, you stand down, we're getting a Reconstruction, right? Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, but then the Grand Compromise, because, hey, as president, I want to get reelected, and I need those Southern votes. So we're going to pull those Union soldiers out. We're going to get rid of all this Reconstruction stuff, and that's the birth of Jim Crow. After that. That is the master narrative that we were all taught. Turns out there's another memory to this thing. One we might call a counter-narrative, purposely constructed to counter the one I just shared with you. These ladies, the daughters of the Confederacy, right? Organized in the same way that formerly enslaved African American people were tending to Union soldiers that needed to be buried. For Memorial Day, we're doing it with Confederate soldiers. Right? They took it on themselves, particularly as women, in this case, of power and wealth, to start to craft an alternative narrative of what they thought we needed to do. That narrative got crystallized into the lost cause narrative. Now, it was interesting talking to some folks at lunch about lost cause. Should be pretty straightforward. That was my attitude coming from Detroit. It's like, wait a minute, we won, y'all lost. This is how it is. No, right? So there are 6 official tenets of this thing. So it was secession, not slavery, that caused the Civil War. African Americans were faithful slaves, right? Loyal to their masters. And the Confederate cause, and they were unprepared for the responsibilities of freedom, right? So they weren't ready to lead their own lives. The Confederacy was defeated militarily only because of the Union's overwhelming advantages in men and resources. If we had equal men and resources, we would have won. Confederate soldiers were so heroic and saintly. Like, that's real. The most heroic and saintly of all Confederates, perhaps of all Americans, was Robert E. Lee. And Southern women were loyal to the Confederate cause and sanctified by the sacrifice of their loved ones. Right? Yeah, I read it. I couldn't believe it either. And there's a movie about it. The first official blockbuster in U.S. history, Birth of a Nation, 1950. The first movie shown to the entire executive staff in the White House and the entire Supreme Court with this quote from President Wilson about how great this movie is. The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. Right. Fascinating. This is a map of where Confederate monuments are. The early ones were all done by the Daughters of the Confederacy. You can see a spike in around 1910, right, all across the country, but other spikes that align with unrest here at the Great Depression. Here at the Civil Rights Movement, right? In our case, I'll show you one in our own backyard that was intentionally placed to intimidate a burgeoning black community. And that's not just it, it's not just the monuments. If you add in the streets, the schools, the courthouses, and all that infrastructure, we're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of memorials to the lost cause. My whole interest in this topic started with a really offhand comment. So, we had the Cultural Landscape Foundation in our region. They do a What's Out There weekend where they do a tour. They bring all these really fancy people into town to talk about, well, what are the great landscapes in your area. And so Charles was like, you need to do something about cultural landscapes. And I was like, okay, I'll do one. This was a week after that happened. The Confederate monument got torn down in Durham. So I was like, well, you know, if you really want to know the triangle, you should see how they looked at Confederate monuments. They're very different. We'll start with Raleigh. So in Raleigh, the Olmsted brothers did the state capital plan with the Confederate monument to our Confederate dead as a part of that. After Bree Newsom climbed the flagpole in Charleston, South Carolina, they changed our state constitution to make any alteration to the state capitol grounds a felony. Right? So they did the preemptive strike. Right? You're never going to touch this thing. Chapel Hill, Silent Sam. We'll talk about that one in a second. It's on the UNC campus, or at least was. And just for the record, all of these are gone now. But that one, they were spending about $300,000 a year on maintenance because of vandalism over that particular statue. Silent Sam, the silent sentry, you know, keeping watch as things move forward. In Durham, and I was joking with a few folks about how easy it was to tear down. So a lot of these came from a mold. So if you've ever seen like a Rodin and you think you saw the real thinker, you didn't see the real thinker. You had a mold, they just press them out. Right? So this thing had no core in it. It came from some boundary up north in upstate New York or something. So what happened was, this is after the Unite the Right protests. The march happened in Charlottesville. There was a rumor in Durham they would come to Durham next. So they didn't come. But thousands of counter protesters showed up. This actually was the first day of the studio that I was co-teaching. And nobody was showing up. I was like, what the hell's going on? They started calling me like, they're turning us off from the freeway. They won't let us into town. I was like, why? And they were like, well, they said there's a protest downtown. So we're like looking out of the window of this office building down the street. And it's like thousands of people out there. So they were just like, oh, since we're all here, let's check out this money. What's funny about it, you can see how she's posing. Right? That's a police photo. They knew exactly who did it. They had it all on video. So now we get to the character part. We'll get to the Silent Sam in a second. In Durham, everybody in Durham knew who did it, knew it was wrong, knew it was a crime, chose not to prosecute. Just let it go. We'll get to Silent Sam in a second. These are quotes. So when some people talk about these are just symbols not meant to impose any pressure, if you will, on people, I'll read these quotes. I trust I may be pardoned for illusion. Howbeit it was rather personal. 100 yards from where we stand, less than 90 days, perhaps after my return from mathematics. I horsewhipped the Negro wench until her skirts hung in shreds because upon the streets of this quiet village she had publicly insulted and maligned the Southern lady. And in rush for protection in these university buildings, where was stationed a garrison of 100 federal soldiers. I performed pleasing duty in the immediate presence of the entire garrison. 30 nights afterwards, slept with a double-barrel shotgun under my head. As Julian Carr, as a dedication to the Silent Sam Memorial. So, it's not neutral. There's tension in these things. This is interesting with UNC. It was the last act of the UNC chancellor to remove it before she was fired. Like, no one knows where this thing is. So there are master narratives, which are these big top-down stories. There are counter narratives, which are totally different frameworks for making sense of the same situation we're doing. Then there are meta narratives, and that's where we all sit. Where we have to make sense of these competing narratives. We have to figure out ways to reconcile them. Doesn't mean that we agree with them, or that we support them, or that we enable them, but we have to acknowledge them and figure out how to make sense as we create our own sense of meaning in history. Some of you have read Research Methods for Landscape Architecture, Values in Landscape Architecture, both by Ellen Deming, who at that time was at Illinois, but now is at NC State, and is the director of our Doctor of Design program, who is a New Yorker. She's from Hudson River area of New York, and both of us, as relocated Northerners, were just completely perplexed by the situation, as well as the theory to figure something out. So started with this weird journal article. This is a journal actually from Germany. There was a student who was talking about, what about Germany in terms of how they handle the Holocaust and how they dealt with Jewish folks. But they reached out and they asked for an article based on what we were dealing with the Confederate monuments because they were concerned about that. That led to a SELA presentation where LSU Press was there, and Lake Douglas was like, we need to do a book on it. And if anybody's ever done a book, well, if you've never done a book, don't do a book. Well, I'll change it. If you do a book, write it yourself. This is collected essays, which is like herding cats. But this is the culmination of this idea of what do we do now? What's the meta narrative? How do we start to read these stories? So empty pedestals for obvious reasons. The cover is the Robert Reed Monument. That was the image that was created by Virginia Tech student that we used countering comparative mirrors of design. We were both inspired by another way of thinking about design, and just medicinal. Thinking about design is healing. We talked about narratives and stories and memory. Design being harmed, we've seen some examples of that. Designs can heal as well, or they will. So focusing on the public good. We all have a commitment as landscape architects to teach landscape literacy, or for people who know it, to listen to them, amplify it. We'll talk about this later. Engaging with storytellers and prioritizing design justice, those are some takeaways. And to get at that, we started to find examples. What did people do after these monuments came down? So the whole second part of this book is case studies from across the Southeast, what architects, artists, landscape architects, and others did. So this is one. Brian Lee has been a friend for a long period of time. I've known him since he started the design justice movement down in New Orleans before he started the Polo case. Sue Mobley is at Monuments Lab. So they're the nonprofit that's been monitoring monument action all over the country for a number of years. After all of the Confederate monuments came down in New Orleans from Mayor Landry's decision, they activated those spaces by gathering local people who lived in those places to gather in that spot to identify stories that were suppressed because there was a Confederate monument there. So there were other narratives that were important that people saw as the identity of their communities, historical events, key people, different things that happened, that there was just no space to deal with that. So they started with convening, really occupying those places, and holding sessions, and having conversations and performances. Then it turned into posters, right? So they started to translate those into graphics, and they started to paste them all over those particular communities in New Orleans. And those grew up into proposals for short-term and long-term public art that really celebrated the other narratives that were always present in those particular places that had never been surfaced. So this way, using more of a grassroots advocacy, political mobilization, mixed media, temporal to long-term strategy, they offer a lot of interesting feedback. Dayton Schrader is an architect at Smith Group. That's the firm I used to work at before I started teaching, based in DC. Created a mobile monument. So this is, says paper monument, so I apologize that. It's actually Society's Cage. What this is a three-dimensional representation of mass incarceration. We took charts and graphs of mass incarceration facing particularly African-American men and turned it into a three-dimensional experience. It's loaded with all kinds of QR codes. You can scan it and get real information. It's lit in the middle of the night. This is it on the National Mall. It was on the National Mall for about a month. This is it in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The people in Tulsa, Oklahoma that celebrate or commemorate the anniversary of the Greenwood District as Hindu there. So this introduces a really interesting idea, which is that do memorials and monuments need to be temporal, which is to say, are they articulating an event that's tied to a place? Are they meant to talk about a broader idea or a trend? How do we make sense of being overwhelmed by so much data all the time? How do we start to turn that into form? And do they have to be in the same place? Okay. So this thing, there's actually an online reservation. Like you get online, schedule, I want to have it, and ship it to you. It's like a DIY. It's fascinating. My good friend Zena Howard, who's the community practice leader for Perkins and Will. Before that, she was the right-hand woman to Phil Freelon. Freelon family is the first family of Durham. Phil Freelon, you may know from being one of the architects and designers of the National Museum of African American History, which was one of his legacy projects before he passed away. So Zena was right there with him, and when he passed away, she basically assumed his leadership. This is for Sycamore Hill Baptist Church. So the extended legacy of the Confederacy and the devaluing of people extended into redlining, into an area not urban renewal. This is in Greenville, North Carolina, or what they would call urban redevelopment, where black communities were targeted for federal resources to be destroyed before new plans to be converted. This memorial in the garden to a church that was significant to that particular community, built from oral histories, other versions into this. A lot of contributors. Walter was nice enough to write forward, but Blair Allen Kelly, Fitz Brundage, Del Upton wrote a really great piece, and a number of others. So we're excited about it. It's coming out in June. We'll close with this. I know the time is running out. There's a big discussion in our profession about repair and care right now. On the extreme end, there are people who say we have too many new landscapes. We can't maintain them all or care for them all. Maybe we need to shift our priority to maintaining and caring for the ones that we have. We've lost that connection to care. If time allows a question and answer, I'll tell you a story about when I first met Peter Walker. He had not someone I would expect that from this idea of care, the language of care, is something that emerged. It's been present for a long period of time, but it's been extended to landscapes and places. And care is necessary for healing. If you got a wound, no matter how long it sits there, it's not cared for, it's still going to hurt. So healing requires care. So to bring this full circle, this is Durham, North Carolina. That big brown spot on the county is a Stagville plantation owned by the Cameron family. So if you ever heard of Cameron Indoor Arena, any Cameron building on UNC's campus is tied to the money in this particular. Stagville was the largest plantation in North Carolina and one of the largest on the East Coast, larger than the city of Durham at its heyday. That red dot is where the wealth that produced that plantation came from. That's where we're working now. Snow Hill 4 plantation. The Snow Hill 4 plantation was the original wealth that allowed the families to expand to Stagville. This is the northern part of Durham. This is Durham County. This is an analysis some of the students did of food-related food desert issues. The darker colors indicating the communities that have least access to fresh food. What's listed as Catawba Trail Farm, which I'm talking about in a second, is the site. It's the plantation site. Something that may be specific to North Carolina, but I'm starting to look nationally at this, is the co-location of former plantation sites and nature conservancies. So people who had plantations were stupid. They were picking sites and landscapes that they thought would be the most productive, best soil, water access, road access, that sort of thing. In our state, there's a correlation between that and the values of conservancy organizations in terms of lands that are no longer being used in production. but now have the ability to complement our web. So you can see it's here, right on the edge of the book. So, where we're working is about 110 acres. It was purchased from a private family in the 1980s from Triangle Land Conservancy and held in a trust. Two women, that one right there, Selby Sellers, and her sister, Lucinda, negotiated an agreement. They are descendants of people who were enslaved, who worked that way. But they saw this opportunity for teaching the next generation about how to produce food, how to learn from nature and enjoy some of the elements that are there as a necessary step of doing it in the exact same spot. The spot where all that trauma occurred, returning to that spot, right? But engaging in healing activities to start to whisk away some of those evil spirits. So these are local drummers and dancers. That young man there is 4 generations removed. He's on the board from the local facility on this side. They've been very successful with community gardens. That's how they make most of their money. Is renting out community garden beds, and about 72 beds. They're always booked. They're always teaching people how to grow food. You can see some of the structures that are there in various stages of disrepair. Agents right, so this is actually going to be repurposed and renovated as a market stall to allow them to sell and trade some of the food that they're growing. We're also on a little river, which is, in our case, a river that has decent water quality. Caveat, every stream in the triangle is an impaired stream because of growth and poor organization. But on a relative scale, the Little River is pretty good. It's a gravelly, really interesting place. People come there already just to walk, to get away from it, to hear birds, to get exercise. There's a older couple walking. These are some of our students working with Ms. Delphine and their board to start to talk about what they'd like to see, what those transformations are that they'd like to see. So a lot of workshops, a lot of engagement. In this case, it makes us think about how we traditionally deliver our practice model. It's very hard sometimes to develop the level of trust required to get into these conversations in a very short period of time. A lot of our students, for example, are like, well, why can't we do more community engagement? We're kind of like, because you can't solve these problems in 16 weeks. It's just not possible. So this overlay of what's needed by these particular communities in your educational mission is where we're trying to go. And where those don't overlap, we're just not going to do it because we know this takes time. So we've been working with them for like 7 years. There's no way that this is taking place. In this case, using some of the participatory design tools that we know. That were developed for people who may not have the technical know-how that we do, but definitely have ideas, give them the proper tools, the right format can express those, listen to board general alternatives, what they'd like to see, and we sort of looked at those, aggregated those to solve their patterns to get at where we're at. And so this is one of the versions of that vision, which includes a lot of elements, there's some time, but highlighting here as part of the investigation, we accidentally stumbled across an unmarked gravesite over out in the woods. This is them sort of honoring the legacy of those folks that are there. That one marked grave was the last family that owned African Americans on that site, Johnson. But as a part of that healing process, saying that this is inclusive of everybody who lived and worked in this particular place. We teamed up with Duke University, Dr. Brian McAdoo, to do a ground-penetrating radar on the site to figure out the extent of these graves. And he's a geologist. So he actually did geology analysis as well because the unmarked graves, as we discovered through some work, those are some of our students doing it on clearing the site, were marked by a particular type of stone that's not native to this particular landscape. Didn't erode, didn't pop out of the ground, so placed there. So we think that there are probably about 70 unmarked graves here. So we're working with them currently on interpreting that, how to protect it, how to preserve it, how to properly deal with it. And because of all these efforts and all their organization, the Triangle Land Conservancy gave them the land. So they're no longer leasing for tenants, they own. So that's a nice part of the story, is that the evidence of coordinated action, a focus resulted in what they were really looking for, was control that land to control that process. All right, with that,